The first sign that something was wrong came when my mom, Linda, called me early in the morning, her voice weak and strained. Yanis, she croaked, something's wrong with the water, it tastes metallic, I feel awful. I was out the door before she could say another word. My mom had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, long before the HOA took over and started micromanaging every blade of grass. I had never trusted them. When I got to her house, she looked pale, clutching her stomach. I rushed to the kitchen, turned on the tap, and let the water run into a glass. The smell hit me before I even brought it close. Something was off. I grabbed my phone and called the county water department to report it, but as I was on hold, there was a knock at the door. There she stood, Clarissa Ames, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Mid-50s, perfectly pressed blouse, and that ever-present look of superiority, like she was waiting for someone to dare challenge her authority. Yanis, she said with a fake smile, I heard you're causing quite the fuss about the water. I narrowed my eyes. Yeah, my mom's sick, something's wrong with it. Clarissa waved a hand dismissively. We had to make some adjustments to the water supply for the neighborhood. A little extra purification never hurt anyone. Purification, I scoffed. It smells like chemicals. What did you do? She shrugged. Just a minor change in our HOA-approved filtration system. If your mother has a sensitive stomach, maybe she should buy bottled water like the rest of us. I clenched my fists. You knew this would happen. She simply smiled. HOA policy, Yanis. We have to think about the neighborhood as a whole, not just one person. That was it. I wasn't going to let this slide. I needed proof. I grabbed the glass of water, poured it into a container, and told my mom I'd be back. I was taking this to a lab. Clarissa's smug expression faltered for just a moment. Now, let's not be dramatic. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. I ignored her and walked away. Whatever they had done, they were going to pay for it. I drove straight to the independent water testing facility on the other side of town. The technician at the front desk took one look at the sample and immediately called over a specialist. Within minutes, they were analyzing it under a microscope, feeding it through their machines, running tests I didn't fully understand. I paced, unable to sit still. My mom was sick because of something the HOA had done, and I needed proof before confronting them. Finally, the lead technician returned, holding a printed report in his hand. This isn't just a bad filtration issue, he said. Your water contains an excessive amount of industrial-grade chlorine and traces of copper sulfate. Both can cause nausea, vomiting, and long-term health issues if consumed regularly. My stomach tightened. They had dumped chemicals into the water supply, and they knew it. That's why Clarissa looked nervous when I said I was getting it tested. Could this be intentional? I asked, already suspecting the answer. The technician hesitated. If this were a municipal water treatment issue, we would have seen complaints all over town, but if this is only affecting a specific neighborhood, he let the implication hang in the air. I thanked him, took the report, and headed straight to the county health department. The receptionist looked up as I placed the document in front of her. I need to report an HOA tampering with a water supply. Her expression turned serious. She scanned the report, then picked up the phone and made a call. Within minutes, a county investigator appeared, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze and a notepad in hand. You said this is tied to an HOA, he asked, already taking notes. I nodded. They changed the neighborhood's water system without telling anyone. My mom drank it and got sick. He exhaled sharply. That's not just an HOA issue. That could be a violation of state health regulations. I handed over the test results and told him everything. He nodded as I spoke, his expression growing grimmer by the second. I'll need to visit the neighborhood, he said. We'll take our own samples. If they did what you say, this could result in serious legal consequences. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. By the time I pulled back into my mom's driveway, she was resting, looking a little better. I had brought her bottled water and made sure she was comfortable before stepping outside again. That's when I spotted Clarissa standing near the HOA's clubhouse, chatting with two other board members. I walked straight toward them, holding up the test results. They saw me coming, and their conversation faltered. You poisoned the water supply, I said, my voice steady. I got it tested, copper sulfate and industrial chlorine. Do you even know what that does to people? Clarissa's smile was tight, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. The HOA board approved the filtration system, she said. Everything was done within our rights. I shook my head. You don't have the right to endanger people. The county health department is already involved. Investigators are coming. The board members exchanged quick glances. One of them, a wiry man with thin-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said. "Perhaps we should discuss this at the next meeting." "No," I interrupted. "You're not going to sweep this under the rug. People are getting sick." Clarissa's fingers twitched. "There's no proof this is related to." I held up the test results again. "This is the proof, and once the county finishes their investigation, you're going to have a lot more to answer for." For the first time, Clarissa didn't have a response. I turned and walked away, but I wasn't done yet. They wanted to force bottled water on the neighborhood while they poisoned the tap. Fine. I was going to make them face their own handiwork. The following morning, I woke up early, determined to escalate things before the HOA could try to cover their tracks. I knew how they operated: delay, deflect, and bury complaints under bureaucratic nonsense. But this wasn't a dispute about mailbox colors or lawn height. This was poisoning. I drove straight to the hardware store and bought 2 large water dispensers, the kind people use for office coolers. Then I swung by the only place in town that still sold the HOA-endorsed bottled water. They had a ridiculous contract with a private supplier, charging outrageous prices to residents who didn't want to risk drinking from the tap. I loaded my cart with as many bottles as I could carry, paid in cash, and hauled everything back to my mom's house. She was feeling a little better, but I told her to rest. I had a plan, and it was time to put it into action. By mid-morning, I was standing in front of the HOA's clubhouse. A few board members were inside, talking in hushed voices. Clarissa was there, of course, along with the wiry man with glasses and a younger woman I hadn't seen before. I walked in like I belonged there, carrying one of the large dispensers filled with the HOA's overpriced bottled water. The conversation stopped immediately. Clarissa folded her arms, forcing a polite expression. "I hope you're not here to cause a scene." I tilted my head. "A scene? No, I just thought you'd appreciate a taste of what you've been forcing on the neighborhood." Before anyone could react, I lifted the dispenser and tipped it forward, sending a controlled stream of water splashing across the clubhouse floor just enough to make my point. Clarissa gasped and took a step back, her perfect shoes now drenched. The younger woman let out a startled noise, and the man with glasses flinched, adjusting his frames. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" Clarissa snapped, her voice rising. I set the container down with a thud. "That's the bottled water you've been profiting from while people get sick from the tap. Thought you might want to see what you're charging people triple the normal price for." The wiry man tried to intervene. "This is completely inappropriate. You're trespassing." I cut him off. "No, you're poisoning people. I already filed a complaint with the county, and investigators are on their way. You still want to act like this is just an inconvenience." Clarissa's jaw tightened. "There's no proof of wrongdoing. The HOA is well within its rights to manage water distribution in the neighborhood." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "Then why are you so nervous?" She stiffened, but before she could respond, the front door swung open. A man in a county inspector's uniform stepped inside, followed by a second investigator carrying a testing kit. The room went silent. The lead inspector scanned the group before settling his gaze on Clarissa. "We received a report of chemical contamination in the neighborhood's water supply. We need to conduct immediate testing." Clarissa's usual composure wavered. I don't see why that's necessary. The HOA has already ensured the water is safe." The inspector didn't even blink. "That decision isn't up to the HOA." I crossed my arms, watching as the investigators set up their equipment. Clarissa knew she was backed into a corner, but she wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm sure this will all be cleared up soon." The inspector ignored her and turned to me. "Where did you get your initial sample tested?" I handed him the report from the independent lab. He read through it, his expression darkening. Then he motioned toward the equipment. "We'll be running our own analysis, but based on these findings, if the results match, the HOA could be facing serious legal consequences." That was what I had been waiting for. Clarissa's face paled slightly, and the man with glasses adjusted his tie nervously. "I'd like to see the filtration system," the inspector continued. "Where is it located?" Clarissa hesitated for a fraction of a second before gesturing toward a side door. "Through there, but I assure you everything is up to code." The inspector didn't acknowledge her attempt at reassurance. He simply walked past her, his colleague following with a testing kit. I stayed behind, watching Clarissa closely. The moment they disappeared into the back room, she turned to me, her voice low and sharp. You have no idea what you've done." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I think I do." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could say more, the younger woman who had been silent until now spoke up. "I told you this would happen," she muttered, shaking her head. Clarissa shot her a glare, but the woman didn't back down. "There were complaints," she continued. "People said the water smelled off and you ignored them. Now it's too late to cover it up." Clarissa's fingers twitched. "That's enough." I looked between them, filing that information away. Someone on the board had doubts. That could be useful. Before anyone could say another word, the inspectors returned. The lead investigator held up a small device, frowning at the readings. "There are dangerously high levels of chlorine and copper sulfate in this system," he said. "This isn't just a mistake. Someone deliberately tampered with the filtration process." Clarissa actually took a step back. That's not possible." The inspector didn't care about her protests. He turned to the man with glasses. "Who is responsible for maintaining this system?" The man hesitated. "The HOA contracts it out." "Then we'll need to see those contracts," the inspector said flatly, "and we'll be issuing an immediate order to shut down this filtration system until further notice." Clarissa was speechless. I folded my arms, watching her carefully contained world start to crumble. She had banked on no one questioning her authority, on people being too complacent to fight back. But now the county was involved, her water supply was being investigated, and she had nowhere to hide. The inspector turned back to me. "You did the right thing reporting this. If we find evidence of negligence, there will be consequences." I nodded, satisfied. Clarissa didn't say another word as I walked out, but I could feel her glare burning into my back. Good. This wasn't over yet. Clarissa's perfect little world was unraveling, and I wasn't about to let her stitch it back together. The county investigators were still inside the clubhouse, combing through the filtration system and demanding documents from the HOA board. Outside, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, their murmurs growing louder as the news spread. I stepped onto the clubhouse steps, meeting the eyes of the people who had been forced to drink tainted water because of the HOA's reckless greed. Some were clutching bottled water, others folding their arms in frustration. A few older residents looked particularly unsettled, their faces lined with concern. One man, probably in his 60s, shook his head. "I knew something was off. My wife's been feeling sick for weeks. We thought it was just a stomach bug, but now," he trailed off, looking toward the clubhouse doors. "You really got the county involved." I nodded. "They're testing everything as we speak. If this HOA knew what they were doing and still let it happen, they're in serious trouble." A woman with short, graying hair stepped forward. "They forced us to buy that expensive bottled water. If they knew the tap was unsafe, that means they profited off of poisoning us." The crowd responded with murmurs of agreement. The anger was building, shifting from quiet frustration to real outrage. That was exactly what I wanted. Clarissa had ruled this neighborhood like a dictator, but the moment people realized they could fight back, her power would crumble. The clubhouse door swung open, drawing everyone's attention. The lead investigator stepped out, his expression unreadable. Clarissa and the other board members followed, their faces tight with unease. The investigator cleared his throat. "We've tested multiple sources within the filtration system and confirmed dangerous levels of chlorine and copper sulfate. This HOA implemented a system that was not properly regulated, and as a result, residents have been exposed to unsafe drinking water." A hush fell over the crowd, then someone spoke up. "What does that mean for us?" The investigator's gaze swept across the group. "For now, we're issuing an immediate shutdown of the current filtration system. Residents should not drink from the tap until further notice. We'll be conducting further tests to determine how long this contamination has been happening and whether there is evidence of negligence." Clarissa stepped forward, her voice controlled but strained. "Surely there's no need for alarm. We were only trying to improve the quality of the water." The investigator didn't even acknowledge her attempt to downplay the situation. If negligence is confirmed, the board could face legal repercussions. That includes fines and potential civil liability for affected residents. The murmurs in the crowd turned to outright anger. Someone shouted, "You knew the water was bad, didn't you?" Clarissa's eyes darted between the investigator and the growing crowd. "We were acting in the best interest of the community. If there was an issue, it was unintentional." I stepped forward before she could keep spinning her excuses. "Then, why did you keep forcing people to buy bottled water instead of fixing the problem?" The moment I said it, more voices joined in. You raised the HOA fees for this filtration system. My kid had been sick for weeks. You told us the water was fine. Clarissa visibly tensed, her carefully composed mask slipping. The wiry man with glasses muttered something to her, but she ignored him, her gaze locked onto the investigator. We'll cooperate fully, of course. There's no need for hostility. The investigator gave her a measured look before addressing the crowd again. If anyone has experienced health issues they believe are related to this water contamination, I urge you to file a report with the county. We'll be compiling all complaints as part of the investigation. That was all the encouragement the neighbors needed. People pulled out their phones, taking photos of the clubhouse, calling family members, and exchanging information. The HOA had spent years intimidating them into silence, but now the tide was turning. Clarissa must have realized she was losing control because she turned to me, dropping the fake politeness. You think you're some kind of hero, Yanis. You've done nothing but stir chaos. I didn't bother lowering my voice. Chaos? No, Clarissa, you and your board did this to yourselves. You poisoned people and thought no one would notice. Her jaw tightened. There will be consequences for this. I met her glare head-on. Yeah, for you. Before she could respond, the younger woman from the board spoke up, her voice hesitant but firm. Clarissa, maybe we should step down. This is serious. Clarissa turned on her so fast the woman flinched. Absolutely not. But it was too late. The crowd had heard. Neighbors exchanged glances, whispers spreading like wildfire. If even members of the board were questioning leadership, then the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was slipping faster than Clarissa could control. The investigator handed me a card. We'll follow up once we have more information. If you find any additional evidence, contact us immediately. I took it, nodding. You'll be hearing from me. Clarissa watched the exchange, her expression unreadable, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew she was losing. As the investigators packed up their equipment and the crowd began dispersing, I turned back to Clarissa one last time. You should start thinking about how you're going to explain yourself in court. For the first time since this started, she had no response. And that silence was the sweetest victory yet. As the crowd slowly dispersed, people lingered in small groups, whispering about what had just happened. The weight of what the HOA had done was sinking in, and it was clear that this wasn't something that would be forgotten by the next board meeting. The damage was too personal, too real. Clarissa stood rigid near the clubhouse entrance, her hand clenched around the folder she had been holding throughout the confrontation. Her board members, the wiry man with glasses and the younger woman, lingered nearby, looking increasingly unsure about their positions. The power dynamic was shifting, and they could feel it. I turned my focus back to my mom's house. As much as I wanted to stay and make sure Clarissa didn't try to weasel her way out of this, I needed to check on her. I walked back, glancing around at the house as I passed. Many of the blinds were pulled back, residents watching everything unfold from inside. Even the ones who hadn't come outside knew something big was happening. When I stepped inside, my mom was sitting up in her chair, sipping from a bottle of clean water. She looked better, but she was still pale. I pulled up a chair next to her and told her everything that had happened at the clubhouse. She listened, nodding occasionally, but her expression remained troubled. They won't just give up, she said after a moment. People like Clarissa don't admit when they're wrong. They find ways to make it someone else's fault. I had no doubt she was right. Clarissa had spent years building her little empire within this neighborhood, and she wasn't going to let it crumble without a fight. But that didn't mean she would win. I checked my phone. Several neighbors had already messaged me, asking what they could do next. Some were sharing their own experiences with the water, others were talking about organizing a larger meeting to force the board to answer for what they had done. That was when I had an idea. If Clarissa wanted to pretend this was just a misunderstanding, then we would make sure there was no escaping the truth. I stood up and grabbed my car keys. I need to go do something, I'll be back soon. My mom gave me a knowing look but didn't question it. I drove straight to a local print shop and placed an order for flyers. Not just any flyers, ones with the full test results from the independent lab, a summary of the county's findings so far, and a call for residents to demand action. I made sure to include contact information for the county investigator so anyone who had been affected could report their symptoms directly. While I waited for the prints, I sent out messages to the neighbors who had reached out. I told them what I was doing and asked if they would help distribute the flyers once they were ready. Within minutes, I had a small team of volunteers ready to make sure every single house in the neighborhood knew exactly what had happened. By the time the flyers were printed and packed into my car, I had a plan. I met up with the first group of volunteers at the park near the center of the neighborhood. There were about 15 of us, a mix of younger families, retirees, and longtime residents who were fed up with the HOA's control. We split into teams and started delivering the flyers door to door. Some people were skeptical at first, but once they saw the official test results, their expressions shifted from disbelief to anger. A man in his 40s stepped out onto his porch, reading the flyer with a deep frown. They really let this happen. I nodded, and they've been forcing people to buy bottled water instead of fixing the problem. His jaw tightened. I've got kids, they've been drinking that water. I handed him the investigator's contact information. You should report anything unusual. The more people speak up, the harder it'll be for them to sweep this under the rug. By the time we finished, nearly every house had a flyer. Some people had already started calling the investigator, and the neighborhood's group chat was blowing up with angry messages. Then something unexpected happened. One of the volunteers, a woman in her 50s, came jogging toward me with wide eyes. Clarissa just called an emergency HOA meeting. She's trying to get ahead of this. I couldn't help but grin. Of course, she was trying to do damage control, but now she was playing defense, and that was exactly where I wanted her. We regrouped at the clubhouse, where a growing crowd had already gathered outside. Clarissa stood at the front, flanked by the wiry man with glasses and the younger woman, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Clarissa was speaking in her usual condescending tone, trying to reassure people that the HOA had always acted in their best interest. But this time, the crowd wasn't buying it. A man in the back shouted, "Why didn't you tell us the water was unsafe?" Clarissa's smile faltered. We were working on a solution. There was no need to cause panic. A woman near the front held up the flyer. "You mean no need to tell us the truth?" The murmurs of agreement were growing louder. Clarissa glanced at the board members beside her, but they didn't offer any support. Then the younger woman finally spoke. "I told you we should have been honest." Clarissa shot her a glare, but the damage was done. The crowd erupted into more questions, more accusations. The control she had spent years building was slipping through her fingers. I stepped forward, holding up my own copy of the flyer. "Clarissa, do you deny that the county found dangerous chemicals in the water?" She hesitated for half a second too long. The results were taken out of context. The investigator's voice rang out from the back. "No, they were." Everyone turned as the county investigator stepped through the crowd, holding a folder of his own. He walked straight to the front, meeting Clarissa's gaze without hesitation. "We've completed our initial findings. The HOA's filtration system was not only improperly installed but also mismanaged, leading to dangerous levels of contamination." Clarissa swallowed hard. Surely there's some way to resolve this without unnecessary legal action. The investigator shook his head. "That's not up to you anymore. The county is moving forward with citations, and residents may pursue legal claims if they choose." The murmurs turned into full-blown conversation. People were discussing lawsuits, demanding refunds for the overpriced bottled water, questioning the legitimacy of the HOA's rule. Clarissa looked around, realizing she had lost control. Then the younger woman stepped forward. "I'm resigning from the board." The wiry man with glasses hesitated, then nodded. "Me too." Clarissa's face twisted with fury. "You can't just abandon your responsibilities." The younger woman held her ground. "This HOA has never been about the residents. It's been about control, and I won't be part of it anymore." The crowd erupted into applause. Clarissa was alone now. No allies, no board to hide behind, just an angry neighborhood and an investigator with a folder full of evidence. I walked up to her, my voice calm. "Looks like your reign is over." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, her perfect composure finally cracking. It was over, and the neighborhood was finally free. Clarissa stormed away from the crowd, her posture rigid, her carefully constructed mask of control crumbling with every step. People didn't clear a path for her like they used to. Instead, they stood their ground, watching her retreat with expressions ranging from disgust to outright rage. The community she had lorded over for so long had turned against her, and she knew it. The investigator remained at the front of the clubhouse, flipping through his folder with a sharp precision, ignoring Clarissa as she disappeared down the sidewalk. The neighbors were still talking amongst themselves, some already making plans to demand refunds from the HOA, others wondering out loud if they could sue. The board was collapsing, and without its enforcers, Clarissa had no one left to shield her from the consequences. I turned to the investigator. "What happens next?" He glanced up, his expression unreadable. We'll be filing official reports with the county. If residents choose to pursue legal action, they'll have solid grounds. He paused, lowering his voice just slightly. But the HOA itself, it's in deep trouble. They violated multiple health codes, and that's not something that gets brushed aside. I nodded. That was what I needed to hear. The murmuring of the crowd grew louder as more neighbors began discussing what they should do with the HOA now that its leadership was dissolving. Some wanted to outright dissolve it. Others wanted to hold an emergency election to replace the board. The younger woman who had resigned earlier was in the middle of one of those conversations, nodding along as people voiced their opinions. Then, from the edge of the crowd, an older man with a weathered face stepped forward. What about criminal charges? The question silenced the conversations around him. All eyes turned back to the investigator, waiting for his answer. He exhaled slowly. That depends. If we can prove that the board knowingly allowed residents to drink contaminated water while profiting from the bottled supply, then yes, there could be criminal liability. Clarissa was still within earshot. She stopped in her tracks, her head snapping toward us. I didn't hesitate, she knew. The investigator turned to me again, raising an eyebrow. She was defensive from the moment I confronted her, I continued. She tried to downplay it, told me people should just buy bottled water instead of drinking from the tap. She knew something was wrong. The investigator studied me for a moment, then glanced at the remaining board members. The wiry man with glasses was already gone, having slipped away during the chaos. The younger woman, however, was still standing by, listening intently. He focused on her. Did the HOA receive any reports or complaints about the water prior to today? She hesitated, shifting on her feet, then taking a deep breath, she nodded. Yes, we got multiple complaints. People said the water smelled strange, tasted off, some even reported stomach issues. Clarissa told us not to acknowledge them. The crowd erupted again, voices raised in outrage. The investigator nodded as if that was exactly what he had expected. Would you be willing to provide a written statement? She looked at him, then at the angry faces of her neighbors. Her expression hardened. Yes. Clarissa turned fully now, her face twisted in fury. You don't know what you're doing. The younger woman didn't flinch. No, Clarissa, you didn't know what you were doing, and now you're going to answer for it. Clarissa's hands clenched at her sides, but she had no more fight left in her. She glanced around, realizing there was no one left to back her up. Then, without another word, she walked away, heading straight for her house. The investigator turned back to the crowd. If anyone else has information, now is the time to come forward. Several hands went up. As the investigator began taking statements, I stepped back, letting the neighborhood take control of what came next. My job was done. The truth was out. The HOA was crumbling and Clarissa was finished. I walked back to my mom's house, feeling lighter than I had in days. When I stepped inside, my mom was still sitting in her chair, sipping water. She looked up, studying my face. You did it, didn't you? I let out a breath and nodded. Yeah, it's over. She smiled faintly. Good. I sat down beside her, the tension finally easing from my shoulders. The HOA had spent years controlling this neighborhood, but now they were powerless. And no matter what happened next, one thing was certain. Clarissa would never hold authority over anyone ever again.